Hello guys, today I wanted to talk about the GNS theory. And a couple of weeks ago, the guy of Table Breaker talked about the GNS theory. And I wanted to add my viewpoint to the conversation, put in my 2 cents if you will. I put a link to their talk in the description below, so you can watch for yourself if you want to know what they had to say about it. GNS theory was developed by Ron Edwards back in the time of the Forge forum quite a while ago. GNS stands for Gamist, Narrativist, and Simulationist. It has been developed to describe the motivation of players interested in role-playing game. Gamist players are interested in overcoming challenges and winning. Narrativists are for the story and the drama surrounding the character. And it doesn't matter so much for a narrativist player if his character dies, if it was an interesting story, in theory. And the simulationists want to explore a believable world that makes sense and is internally consistent. The idea of a GNS theory is that if you, as a GM, understand into what type of your players fall, you'll be better equipped to provide them with good experiences. And of course, there are flaws about this theory. Firstly, very few players fit neatly into one category. We might all have a dominant type. We might lean more toward gamist or narrativist or simulationist, but very few people interested in RPG are strictly into one camp. If you were strictly gamist, you'd probably be more interested in board game like Zombicide and Descent, which can be good fun and there's nothing wrong with playing those kind of game, but they're not RPG. If you were purely into the narrativist side, you would be more into collaborative storytelling or improv theater maybe. Maybe people doing like diceless game or more do fall more into that category. But at some point, like, do they even qualify as game anymore? And the simulationist side is probably the one that is the most misunderstood. People often think that it's how worried you are about the exactitude of a system and how it details every minutia of life. But it's not quite that. The simulationist player, according to GNS theory, is concerned with exploring a believable world that is self-consistent, and is the player that is the most concerned about metagaming, and that is always try to act as this character would logically do, regardless if as a player he knows that it might not be the best way of action for winning, or if he doesn't feel that it would lead to the most interesting story. I don't know what a player would be like solely simulationist side would be like. Maybe it would just be like somebody into praxeology. And of course, like the example I gave are extreme. Like I said, when we're talking about leaning a certain direction rather than the other. But the thing is, everybody that is interested in role-playing game would have a bit of all three. And it's likely that you'll have a different players at your table leaning in different direction. So if the theory is that it's to help you cater to your players better, well, you have to offer all three type of experience anyway. Edwards then evolved GNS theory into the threefold theory, where now instead of focusing on the type of player, he was focusing on the type of games. The idea being that different games can serve better certain type of play. It used similar terms for two aspects, like a game and simulation, but narrative side has been renamed to drama. And again, RPGs don't tend to fit nicely into one category. There are some mechanics that hints more toward one side rather than the other. Like if we look at game like old school D&D, where character growth come from killing monster and collecting loot, it's more gamist than if you look at a system that would use milestone for XP. Again, the simulationist side seem to be like not one out here. I think that in both of those theories, they would work better as a gamist narrativist axis, with simulationist being a third thing tacked on maybe, or maybe a second axis. What would be an example of a mechanic that would promote the simulationist side? Maybe the virtue system in Pendragon would be it. Like I talked about it before, but it could be seen as something that push you to act in a certain way, but then you're rewarded significantly for acting like your character would do. So we're kind of back on the gamist side. I'm not the biggest fan of the GNS theory or the threefold theory. I've highlighted some of its flaws already, but it's also like analyzing a cake in terms of flour, eggs, and sugar, and trying to figure out which one make the essence of the cake. And it's the mix of them, and other elements as well that makes a cake a cake. Similarly, it's the mix of a narrative and a game and the game side of thing, and in a self-consistent world that makes a role-playing game a role-playing game. The three aspects are not mutually exclusive, and they usually work better when put together. A game like The Burning Wheel is usually seen as a more narrative, but what makes it so? Is it the fact that you have some mechanic for social resolution? That sounds pretty gamey to me. You don't even necessarily have to roleplay a conversation in The Burning Wheel. You can just say, oh, I want to convince the king of X, and then you make a script of your little combat mechanic for social encounter. And so you go like, okay, first I'm going to do a soothing platitude, and then a persuasion, and then a falsehood. And if you win the encounter, then you convince the king. And for those unfamiliar with The Burning Wheel, combat and social encounter can be resolved by selecting like 3 maneuver each round, and each maneuver interact with the one selected by your opponent, and then you go closer to your goal or further away. It's pretty gamey. And not only are the simulation, narrative, and game aspect just ingredients of role-playing game, they are not necessarily the only important ingredient. And there are also other quirks that throw shade at GNS theory. Like I said, the idea that a gamist player gets fun from overcoming challenge and winning, but people who are interested in games that are traditionally seen as more gamist don't tend to care so much if their character dies. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that challenges, to be significant, they need to be rewarding. They have to have real consequence for failure, and to have a real chance of failure. And on the other end, gamers that would be seen as more narrativists, like many of the new D&D player, they get really upset if their characters die, even if it's a good death that would serve the drama. You even have people saying that having a character die is a mark of being a bad GM. So for some reason, GNS theory is still talked about today in the role-playing world, but it's mostly bunked. Or maybe it's the start of an idea that never got the refinement that it needed. It feels like a pseudo-intellectual that came up with some theory out of thin air and tried to fit reality into it, rather than the opposite. Maybe there is a spectrum between a gamist and narrativist for mechanics, and there could be some value into thinking about that when doing some game design, but I don't think it has much value when preparing your game. I think it would be good to have a theory of RPG design, both for when designing a game and when preparing a campaign, but GNS and threefold ain't it. Anyway, that's what I want to talk about today. Let me know what you think about all this down below. And thank you for watching. Have a good day and take care.